The valet barely glanced at me as I pulled up to the entrance of Aspen Grove Resort. I handed him my keys with a soft murmur of thanks, feeling the weight of the evening pressing on my shoulders. The grand double doors loomed ahead like an entrance to a world I no longer belonged to. Inside, the glimmer of a chandelier, just gaudy enough to remind you that you didn't belong, caught my eye. It sparkled like something out of Versailles, casting sharp reflections across the marble floors. I tucked my clutch beneath my arm and walked past the concierge who handed me a name tag, Rebecca Cole. It was printed in generic serif font, no title, no distinction, just my name, plain and unremarkable. Chloe's touch, no doubt. She'd made sure of that. I kept my sleeve down, hiding the West Point ring I still wore beneath it. I didn't want anyone to see it. Not tonight. Not in this place. The ballroom doors swung open before me, the low hum of laughter spilling into the hallway. A mix of cheers and clinking wine glasses echoed from inside, punctuated by the occasional burst of applause. The room was already filled with faces I hadn't seen in years. Some of them were familiar, yet every one of them seemed foreign. The main hall resembled a lavish theater stage, long tables draped in ivory linens, floral centerpieces crowned with gaudy crystals, and a 6-tier cake perched on a pedestal at the back, like it was the star of the show. At the front, a large screen flickered with slideshow images of the class's most treasured moments: prom, debate club, the class trip to D.C. The images scrolled past like a highlight reel, and there she was, Chloe, front and center in half of them. Me? Maybe 3. Chloe Cole, my younger sister, had already taken the stage when I entered. She stood there in a red sheath dress, practically screaming power. Her voice flowed through the microphone like velvet, effortless charisma coating every word. And after 15 years at the Department of Justice, I'm proud to say I've recently been appointed Deputy Director for Western Cyber Oversight, she announced, her laughter echoing through the room like a carefully orchestrated performance. But I'll never forget where it all started, right here at Jefferson High. The crowd laughed. I couldn't help but feel the sting. She'd crafted this version of herself, successful, polished, with a touch of humility for good measure, and I was left here on the outskirts, forgotten. From across the room, I spotted my seat, table 14, near the buffet, close to the exit. I sat alone, no centerpiece, just half-eaten shrimp cocktail on a shared plate. As if on cue, Jason Hart noticed me from 3 tables away. He hadn't changed much, still tall, still smug. He made his way over, drink in hand. Suit perfect, leaning in with the same smirk he wore back in high school. "Becca," he said, his voice smooth like he'd been waiting years for this moment. "Still stationed in the desert? Or pushing papers in Kansas now?" I smiled tightly, the words coming out barely a whisper. "Nice to see you too, Jason." He laughed. "Come on, I'm joking. But seriously, didn't you study pre-law?" His tone shifted, leaning in slightly. "What happened?" Before I could answer, a woman in pearls leaned toward another guest, her whisper too loud to ignore. "Didn't she drop out of law school? Shame. So much potential." I caught Melissa Young's eye from 3 tables away. She gave a faint smile. I returned it, unsure if it meant pity or solidarity. Probably both. The air was thick with laughter and small talk. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, as if I was still that nobody from back in school. But I had long since stopped explaining. Myself. Tonight, I was invisible by choice, and it didn't bother me, or at least it shouldn't. I adjusted my sleeve again, hiding the West Point ring. This was my life now. The evening pressed on, thick with the buzz of laughter and the clink of champagne flutes. As the waiters moved silently among the tables, replenishing drinks and serving plates of prime rib and scalloped potatoes, I sat at the edge of the room. Table 14, near the buffet, was the perfect spot if you didn't want to be seen. And that was exactly how I felt. The others were clustered near the front, the spotlight squarely on Chloe, as usual. She was the star of the evening, just as she had been in high school. Nothing had changed. From across the room, I could see her talking animatedly with Dr. Hartman, CEO Wong, and Senator Gill, all of them laughing like they shared some secret only the successful were allowed to know. Chloe didn't look back at me. She never did. My eyes darted to the group sitting nearby. Jason Hart, the guy who had been the golden boy of Jefferson High, standing with a drink in hand, flanked by a few others I barely recognized. There was Melissa Jung, a tall, thin woman who used to be in my English class, now wearing an outfit that screamed success with her pearl earrings and expensive-looking blazer. She caught my eye and smiled faintly, but I didn't know if it was out of pity or something more genuine. Either way, it wasn't enough to make me feel like I belonged. I should have been used to it by now. The awkward silence, the feeling of being an outsider. After all, I had learned how to be invisible long ago. But Jason, he couldn't leave it alone. His voice cut through the noise of the ballroom as he made his way over to me. His suit was sharp, almost too perfect, and the confident smirk never left his face. "Becca," he said, as if we were old friends picking up where we left off. His voice dripped with that familiar smugness, the kind that always made me want to roll my eyes but never did. "Still stationed in the desert?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Or are you pushing paper in Kansas now?" I stiffened, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Nice to see you too, Jason," I replied, my voice polite but cold. "Come on, I'm joking," he said, laughing easily, clearly enjoying the tension he was creating. "But seriously, didn't you study pre-law?" He leaned in just a little too close, as if inspecting a relic from the past. "What happened?" I could feel the familiar sting of old wounds being reopened. Law school, the path I had been on, the one everyone thought I would take. The one I'd left behind when I enlisted, when I chose something more important than sitting behind a desk. Before I could answer, a soft, high-pitched voice interrupted me. Didn't she drop out of law school? Shame. So much potential. It was. Melissa Young leaning toward someone across the room, loud enough for me to hear but pretending not to notice. I could feel the heat of her words, like a slap to the face, and for a moment, the weight of all their judgment pressed down on me. A sharp laugh escaped Jason, who was clearly delighted by Melissa's comment. "Oh, that's rich," he said, looking back at me. "I thought you were headed for greatness, Becca. Seems like you missed the mark. Maybe you should have stayed in law school." I could feel the eyes on me, the silent judgment, the ones that said I was nothing, that I'd thrown my life away when I walked away from the Ivy League to join the military, to fight for something that most of them couldn't even begin to understand. But I didn't flinch. I didn't even let the words sting. Instead, I picked up my water glass, my fingers curling tightly around the cool glass. It trembled slightly in my hand, but I steadied it before anyone could see the shake in my fingers. The glass of water felt like the only thing holding me together in this room, this sea of loud, shallow laughter. I sat back in my chair, looking at Jason with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Nice to see you again, Jason," I repeated, the words colder this time. "I've been keeping busy." "Yeah," he said, still smirking. "Busy? Well, good for you." His eyes darted to my sleeve where I hid the West Point ring beneath my fabric. His gaze flickered briefly with confusion, but he didn't ask about it. Instead, he turned and walked away, off to rejoin the others at the front of the room, leaving me with the taste of his words hanging in the air like smoke. The silence, I was left with felt suffocating. I took a long, steadying breath, feeling the weight of their glances on my back. I didn't have to look up to know that they were all watching, whispering, judging. But it didn't matter. What did it matter if they didn't know who I was? If they didn't see the life I had lived, the battles I had fought in silence, I was no longer the girl they had once known. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't owe them anything. But they didn't know that. Not yet. I reached for the shrimp cocktail, taking a bite as I stared ahead, pretending to pay attention to the conversations happening around me. But my mind was elsewhere, focused on the steady pulse of my heart. And the fact that I wasn't invisible. Not anymore. Jason and the others didn't see me, but they would. One day they would. The noise from inside the ballroom felt muffled now, like I was moving through water. Their laughter, the clinking of glasses, all of it faded as I stepped out onto the balcony. The cold night air was a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room, biting at my skin as I leaned against the railing, looking out at the sprawling golf course below. It was quiet out here, far from the glossy, curated world inside the ballroom. I needed the silence. For a long moment, I stood, still, taking in the dark treetops that swayed under the weight of the night. Above, the stars hung like forgotten jewels, distant and cold, while the resort lights bled golden into the grass, creating a haze that blurred the boundary between the real world and the one I was pretending to be part of tonight. Inside, Chloe's voice was likely still rising above the rest, recounting her latest accomplishments with practiced ease. Deputy Director for Western Cyber Oversight. The title rolled off her tongue as if it was her birthright. And to them, it probably was. She was everything they wanted to be. Everything I had once thought I would be, before I chose a different path. It's not that I didn't belong here. I had simply chosen to fade into the background. I wasn't here for applause, and I wasn't here to be seen. The wind tugged at my sleeve, just enough to remind me that I hadn't let go of the past completely. My ring. I pulled my sleeve down, the West Point ring hidden beneath the fabric. No one here knew about it. No one knew about any of it. With one last look at the reunion's distant glow, I pulled out my phone. It vibrated softly in my hand, and I glanced down at the encrypted message waiting for me. Incoming call. LSJ-2 Cyber Command. My heart didn't skip a beat. This wasn't a coincidence. Not after everything I had been through. The time had come. The timing of it, just after Jason's mocking remark, was almost poetic. I tapped the screen, and the face that appeared on the other side of the call was familiar, but worn. Colonel Marcus Ellison, his face shadowed by the lack of sleep and the long hours he had likely spent on surveillance. His voice came through, low and immediate. Ma'am, the situation's changed. We need you back in DCA ASAP. Intercepts are showing movement. It's critical we get your eyes on it. His words hit with the weight of certainty, but the urgency in his tone told me just how much was riding on this. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stepped back from the railing, my feet moving automatically as I started to pace along the balcony. They still don't know who I am, I thought, almost absently. They saw the navy dress, the quiet woman standing at the edge of the ballroom, the one they dismissed without a second glance. They didn't know what I'd done or where I'd been. They didn't know what I had become. My eyes flickered over the phone, scanning the data that flashed across the screen. Project Merlin. The word alone sent a chill down my spine. The mission, still under a tight veil of secrecy, was something the public would never understand. But I did. I had carried the weight of its failure and the promise to never let it happen. Again. 4 red zones. That was the reality. That was the danger. I couldn't afford to get caught up in the past. Not when the future was already unraveling. I let the encrypted screen go dark, the soft glow now nothing more than a memory. Then, as if I could finally breathe without the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, I turned to face the empty expanse of the balcony. No one could see me here, but they would. They would soon enough. I glanced down at my watch, the time ticking away with each passing second, a reminder of just how quickly everything could change. 50 minutes to extract. I slipped the phone back into my clutch, sliding my hand over the smooth leather before pulling my sleeve down one more time. The West Point ring caught the dim light for just a moment, its engraving now a personal promise, a mark of everything I had given up. I knew what was coming. I knew what I was leaving behind, but it didn't matter. I had a job to do. Before I turned back toward the ballroom, I paused, taking one last look at the world outside. The calm, quiet world that no one could touch. Here, there were no accolades, no awards, just the weight of choices made in the silence. And that was enough. As I re-entered the ballroom, I could already hear the rise of conversation again. They hadn't noticed I was gone. They wouldn't, not yet. They would never understand. I made my way back to the table, the shadows of the evening still clinging to me like a second skin. No one looked up as I sat down again, picking up the half-empty glass of water. I studied it for a moment, as though it held the answer to everything that had happened. There was a part of me that wanted to turn to them, to Jason, to Chloe, to everyone who had dismissed me as just another face in the crowd, and say, "This is who I really am. This is my story." But I didn't. Instead, I adjusted my sleeve, feeling the ring beneath my fingers. My secret was still safe. For now. But they'd find out. All of them. Soon enough. And when they did, they'd finally see me for what I truly was. Not the quiet woman in the navy dress, but a force that had been quietly shaping the world while they were busy laughing at someone they didn't understand. And when that moment came, they would wish they had never turned their backs on me. The night was drifting on, as if it had already set into its comfortable rhythm. But something was off. The usual hum of laughter, the clink of glasses, the soft shuffle of high heels across polished floors. It all seemed to blend into the background. No one was paying attention to the woman sitting at table 14, the forgotten one at the edge of the room. But then the sound changed. It was subtle at first, just a distant whirring noise, barely audible over the conversations and music inside. At first, I thought it was nothing, maybe just the hum of a car engine or an overactive air conditioner. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakable. The blades. A low rumble began to vibrate the very ground beneath my feet. The crowd inside the ballroom paused, like the collective breath of the room had been held in unison. The noise grew, louder, and this time the source was undeniable. A helicopter. I stood up instinctively, drawn toward the sound, my heart picking up its pace. The doors of the ballroom suddenly felt too small, as if the room itself could no longer contain what was coming. The crowd inside began to murmur, their voices rising in confusion and curiosity. They turned toward the windows, squinting into the night as if searching for the source of the sound. It had grown louder now, the roar of the rotors unmistakable, an authority in the air that no one could ignore. I couldn't help but smile, just slightly. This was it. This was the moment when everything would change. I glanced around the room, knowing they had no idea what was about to happen. Chloe was still at the front, her voice drifting in and out of my focus as the helicopter grew closer. Her eyes weren't on me. No, they were fixed on the spotlight she had carved out for herself tonight. She would never notice the shift until it was too late. The rotor blades sliced through the air with a sharp precision that seemed to split the very atmosphere around it. The sound was deafening now, louder than anything I had ever experienced. The crowd in the ballroom was completely distracted, their whispers rising to a crescendo as they pressed closer to the windows. And then, like something out of a movie, the helicopter came into view. The large, matte black military aircraft appeared from the trees beyond the resort grounds, emerging from the shadows with a mechanical grace. The searchlights on its wings pierced through the air like twin beams, cutting through the haze of the night. The wind whipped up, scattering leaves and petals from the meticulously manicured gardens below as the helicopter began its descent. The blades of the rotor kicked up a storm of debris, sending napkins flying, and the guests stumbled back, shielding their eyes from the oncoming chaos. I could see their faces now, wide-eyed, shocked, and completely disoriented. They had no idea who was stepping into their world. The helicopter hovered just above the ground, the noise blurring the sound of the music and the murmur of voices. For a brief moment, everything fell silent. And then, with a final, earth-shaking roar, it touched down, sending a final wave of dust and leaves into the air. I remained standing, steady on my feet, watching as the door of the helicopter slowly swung open. The silence that followed was almost surreal. It was a heavy kind of quiet, like the whole world had paused in anticipation, waiting for what was to come next. From the cockpit, a figure emerged. Colonel Marcus Ellison, tall, dressed, in full military uniform, his polished boots crunching against the gravel path as he walked toward the crowd. His face was grim but determined, eyes focused solely on one thing, me. He didn't look left or right as he moved through the stunned crowd. He had no need to. His purpose was clear. The sudden realization swept through the room, like a gust of wind knocking over the carefully arranged glasses on the tables. The guests stood frozen, mouths agape, eyes wide in disbelief. The colonel reached the end of the path, his boots clicking against the concrete like clockwork. Then, without hesitation, he turned to face me. He stood tall, his expression unreadable, and he saluted. It was precise, deliberate, military perfection. "Lieutenant General Cole," he said, his voice carrying over the stunned silence. "Ma'am, the Pentagon requires your presence. Immediate briefing." The words hit the air with the force of a bomb, causing a ripple of gasps to spread through the crowd. It was a shockwave of recognition that left everyone frozen. Their eyes darted between me and the colonel, processing the magnitude of the moment. I stood there for a moment, letting the gravity of it sink in. The confusion, the disbelief, and the admiration in the eyes of everyone in that room was palpable. But I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence linger, allowing the truth to settle over them like a blanket. The air was heavy, but it wasn't with judgment anymore. It was with respect. They had all assumed I was just another woman who had gotten lost in the shuffle of life. They'd assumed I was nothing more than a forgotten face from high school, someone who had failed to live up to their expectations. But now, the truth was undeniable. I wasn't the forgotten one. I had been busy, quietly serving a greater purpose. The colonel didn't wait for them to respond. He had done his part. I turned toward the door, walking steadily with the weight of their eyes on my back. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of voices as they tried to piece together what had just happened. I knew what they were thinking. They were trying to process the impossibility of it all, but none of it mattered. They couldn't understand. Not yet. As I stepped through the door, the colonel was beside me, still silent. But I knew what he was thinking. He had no doubt seen this play out 100 times before. He'd seen it with others. Those who were unnoticed until they were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. But I wasn't thrust into the spotlight. This was my choice, my purpose, and it was time for them to see it. The helicopter blades began to spin again, rising with a final deafening roar. I felt the last of the debris swirl around me, but it didn't touch me. I was already gone, already moving toward the future, leaving the past behind. Tonight, the reunion would remember me, not as a forgotten face in a Navy dress, but as Lieutenant General Cole, the woman they had never expected to see. The door to the ballroom swung open with a soft groan as I stepped back inside, the whirlwind of the helicopter's departure still echoing in my chest. The sounds of the reunion felt far off now, as though they were coming from a distant world. Inside, the laughter had faltered, replaced with a growing hum of confusion. The guests stood in small clusters, whispering among themselves, their eyes flicking between the colonel and me. No one spoke immediately. The once loud atmosphere of clinking glasses and idle chatter was now a muted buzz, the crowd still grappling with the reality of the moment. Jason Hart stood at the front, mouth slightly agape, his eyes flickering toward Chloe, who was still standing by the stage, her posture stiff and unsure. I didn't wait for them to approach me. My steps were measured, deliberate as I moved through the room. The sound of my heels was like a signal that it was time to put the noise of the past behind me. As I passed, the crowd parted, some of the former classmates daring to glance at me with a mix of awe and disbelief. No one spoke, not yet. I made my way toward the center of the room, directly in front of the large projection screen where Chloe had been standing moments before, basking in the glow of her own success. She was frozen, her eyes locked on me, her hand gripping the podium tightly as if it were her anchor in a storm. I could see the slight tremble in her fingers, a small crack in the polished image she had worked so hard to maintain. She wasn't used to this. I stopped just a few feet away, facing the crowd now, with Chloe standing to my left, trying to maintain her composure. Jason had made his way up to her side, his posture stiff, a faint hint of discomfort on his face. The whispers in the room had died down, and I could feel every eye on me, every ear waiting for the truth I was about to share. The silence stretched, on for what felt like hours, but I didn't feel the pressure, not anymore. I took a breath, the air heavy with the weight of their expectations. But I wasn't here to meet those expectations. I wasn't here for them. Many of you don't know who I really am, I said, my voice calm but carrying across the room. The words were simple, yet they hung in the air like a challenge. Jason took a step forward, the smirk still lingering on his lips, though it faltered as he spoke. "Come on, Becca," he said, his voice trying to hold on to the same mockery from before. "What is all this, a military stunt? You've been in the army all these years, and now you're here, pretending like this is your moment?" He laughed, though the humor was hollow, tinged with uncertainty. "This isn't you." I didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of his words sink in. The crowd was hanging on to every syllable, but I wasn't here to explain myself to him. "I didn't disappear, Jason," I said quietly, my eyes meeting his with a calm that he clearly didn't expect. "I just stopped explaining myself." The room fell silent at my words, the truth of them striking deeper than I had intended. I could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the realization that this wasn't some fleeting moment, some stunt. This was real. This was my truth. Chloe, on the other hand, had already stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she moved to stand beside me. She had a half smile on her face, that practiced, rehearsed look that I had grown so familiar with, the one that hid everything, the one that always made sure the spotlight was on her. "Rebecca," she began, her tone sugary sweet, though I could hear the tightness underneath. "This is really quite the surprise. I didn't think this is how you'd want to make an entrance." Her voice carried a slight edge, the words thinly veiled in mock concern. I looked at her, my gaze steady, my expression unreadable. "I never needed the spotlight, Chloe. I've been serving in silence, in places where no one even knows my name. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The truth hung in the air between us, the unspoken history that she had tried so hard to rewrite. Her history. Chloe's smile faltered for a moment, and I saw the tension that ran through her. She took a small, calculated step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the microphone again. But I had already reclaimed my space. It was my turn to speak. "I didn't wear a name tag because I needed it," I continued, my eyes now sweeping the room. I wore one because it was a reminder to me of who I really am, who I've always been. And no amount of accolades or applause will ever change that. Jason shifted on his feet, his confident facade cracking for just a second. I could see the conflict brewing in his eyes, but he didn't have the words to match the weight of mine. Chloe's posture was still stiff, her eyes flashing between me and the crowd. But she didn't speak. Not yet. The room had gone still, their reactions coming in slow motion, as if the weight of the truth had finally sunk in. I could feel their gaze, no longer dismissive, no longer curious, but full of something else. Something they had never seen in me before. Respect. I looked over at Chloe. Her chest was rising and falling, her breath betraying her usual composure. "This was never about competition, Chloe," I said quietly. "You made it about that. But this was never about us. This was about the people I chose to protect, the ones whose names won't ever be etched on a plaque, but whose lives are better because I chose to serve." She stared at me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't place. For a moment, I almost thought I saw something like regret in her gaze, but she quickly masked it, brushing the hair from her face and straightening her posture once more. "Rebecca," she started, but I cut her off before she could continue. "No, Chloe," I said firmly. "You had your chance to speak. Now it's my turn." I turned back to the room, to the faces I had known so well, and the ones I had only just met tonight. I am not here to demand recognition. I don't need their applause. I don't need any of you to validate my existence. But the one thing I will always stand for is the truth. The truth that I gave everything for my country, for the people who couldn't speak for themselves. And now, after all these years, it's time for me to tell my story. The room was silent, not out of judgment, but out of understanding. The clinking of glasses, the buzz of whispered conversation, it all stopped. Chloe shifted behind me, her hand clutching the podium as though she was trying to stay anchored. I knew what she was thinking. She couldn't possibly understand this. Not yet. But the truth wasn't hers to shape anymore, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Jason took a deep breath, clearly unsettled. But his eyes were no longer mocking. He was seeing me now. Really seeing me. I turned away from him, my gaze sweeping over the crowd once more. Some of us protect in silence. We serve because we believe in something greater than ourselves. And that doesn't make us any less visible. It just means we don't need the recognition to keep going. And with that, I stepped away from the podium, the echoes of my words lingering in the room as I walked past the stunned faces of my past. There was no applause, no cheers. But that didn't matter. I had already reclaimed my legacy. It was enough. The ballroom was suffocating in its silence, the hum of conversation dying away as I walked through the doorway. Inside, the music had slowed, the chatter ceased, and the eyes of every person in. The room followed me as I moved through the crowd. The sharp click of my heels was the only sound, echoing in the stillness as I made my way toward the center of the room. I could feel their gazes on me, the confusion and disbelief radiating from the people I had once called friends, the same people who had dismissed me, who had written me off as nothing more than a forgotten face from high school, now watched me as if I were someone they'd never met. Chloe was standing by the stage, her back straight, her hands clutched, tightly around the podium as if it were her lifeline. Her polished demeanor, the carefully rehearsed smile, all seemed to crumble in the face of this new reality. I could see it in her eyes, the flicker of unease, the realization that the narrative she'd so carefully constructed had just been shattered. Jason Hart, still standing near the front with a drink in hand, looked like he had seen a ghost. The smirk that had so often graced his face now seemed fragile, like it might crack at any moment. He looked to Chloe, then back to me, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the quiet, unassuming girl he'd once known. I didn't. Stop. I didn't wait for them to speak. I didn't need to. This was my moment. Becca, Jason finally managed, his voice a little too loud, almost as if to cover up his own unease. What is all this? Seriously, you were just a kid from high school. Who? I cut him off with a single glance, my gaze cold, unwavering. No more explanations. Instead, I turned to the room, letting the weight of their silence settle. I've been many things, I said softly, my voice carrying through the room, but one thing I've never been is a stranger to sacrifice. The words hung in the air. They were simple, but heavy with meaning. I took a moment, watching the reactions from my former classmates. I could see them shifting uncomfortably, unsure of how to process the transformation. Some were still confused, others intrigued, but none of them dared speak yet. Chloe, of course, couldn't let it go. She moved forward, her heels clicking sharply, against the floor as she positioned herself between me and the crowd. Her voice, once so confident, now trembled slightly as she spoke. "Rebecca," she said, trying to mask the tension in her voice with a thin smile. "This isn't really what you were meant for, right? I mean, we both know you could have had it all. Law school, maybe even a career in politics." She gestured toward the glittering crowd. This is a little beneath you. Don't. You think?" I could hear the slight edge in her words, the need for control that she had always maintained. But I was no longer that girl who would bend under her scrutiny. I stood my ground, the years of self-doubt and silence now stripped away, leaving only the truth behind. "I didn't choose this life for approval," I replied, my tone even, measured. "I didn't choose it to win your respect, Chloe. I chose it because it was the right thing to do. I chose it because I believe in something bigger than me." Chloe faltered for a moment, her smile stiffening, but she quickly recovered. "You know what, Becca?" she said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "You always were so mysterious. But some of us don't mind the spotlight, you know. We like being seen." Her words were a subtle jab, an attempt to reclaim some of the control. She had lost, but I wasn't fooled. She wanted to be the center of attention, always had, always would. It wasn't about the truth. It was about maintaining her position. But I wasn't here for her. I wasn't here for any of them. I took another step forward, my eyes scanning the room. I didn't need to explain myself to Chloe. I didn't need to justify my choices to anyone. I had done my job, fought battles in silence, and walked away without ever expecting a thank you. That was the way I had chosen to live. "No one here knows what it's like to serve in silence," I said, my voice low but steady. "To work, in the shadows, to fight without recognition. And that's how I've lived my life. I didn't serve for medals or applause. I served because I believe in protecting those who can't protect themselves. I've made sacrifices you'll never understand, and that's okay. I didn't expect you to." The words felt right. They had been building inside me for years, a quiet strength that I had kept hidden, waiting for the moment when I could finally speak them aloud. Jason, still standing off to the side, cleared his throat, his earlier smirk gone. I didn't. "No," he said quietly, his voice hesitant. "I didn't know what you were really doing all this time. I thought you thought I had nothing left to offer," I cut him off, my gaze piercing. "You thought I'd faded away, that I was just another name on a yearbook page, but I've been doing something you couldn't even imagine. I didn't need you to see me. I didn't need anyone to see me. I just needed to do my job." There was a long pause, a heavy silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The weight of my words hung in the air, and for the first time in the entire evening, the room felt still. Chloe's face had gone pale, the facade she had worked so hard to maintain now cracking. She hadn't expected this. She had thought that by keeping me in the background, she could stay in the spotlight, that she could remain the one everyone looked to. But tonight, the spotlight wasn't on her. It was on me. I turned back to the crowd, my voice unwavering. I've sacrificed more than most of you will ever know. I've faced battles, both internal and external, that have shaped me into who I am today. And I didn't do it for you. I did it for the people who need someone to fight for them. The room was silent. The weight of my words had finally landed, and no one was quite sure how to respond. Chloe's smile had faded completely now, her carefully constructed image crumbling in front of her. But she still stood there, her arms crossed defensively, her eyes flicking between me and the rest of the room. I don't need your applause, I said, my words calm but resolute. I didn't come here for validation. I came here to remind myself that I am enough. I am enough without your approval, without your recognition. I let those words linger, letting them sink into the room. They were my truth. The truth I had been hiding for so long. And now, finally, it was out in the open. I took a breath, letting the silence stretch for just a moment longer before turning and walking away from the crowd. There was nothing more to say, nothing more to prove. And as I walked past the stunned faces of my classmates, I knew that I had finally reclaimed my legacy. The quiet girl they had once mocked was now the woman they would never forget. The air in the ballroom felt thick now, heavy with anticipation. The previously distant chatter and laughter had been replaced by whispers, soft, hesitant, unsure of themselves. Every eye in the room was now trained on me, the woman who had quietly stood in the shadows for so long, whose accomplishments had been hidden from the world. Chloe had retreated back to the stage, her earlier attempt to reassert her dominance, fading away into uncertainty. She stood beside the podium, her hands gripping it tightly, her eyes shifting between me and the crowd. Jason, too, was silent now, his earlier words lost to the weight of the truth. I had come into the reunion tonight as the overlooked figure, the one dismissed by nearly everyone, even by those who were closest to me. I had been the forgotten woman, the one who seemed to have faded into the background. But that woman, the silent, unnoticed Rebecca Cole, was no more. The crowd, still reeling from the helicopter landing and my subsequent revelation, began to murmur among themselves. No one dared speak aloud, but the tension was palpable. It was as if the air itself had changed, vibrating with the realization that something monumental had just occurred. I moved forward, my pace measured but unwavering. Each step was deliberate, every inch of my movement making it clear that this moment, this unveiling, was mine. I stopped in front of the crowd, my back straight, my posture unyielding. The room was utterly still now, their stares fixed on me, awaiting what I would do. Next, let's get one thing clear, I began, my voice cutting through the tension. I'm not here to seek your approval, to beg for your recognition. I never needed it, but I'm done hiding, done being the ghost you all thought I was. Tonight, I'm not just Rebecca Cole, your high school classmate. I'm Lieutenant General Rebecca Cole, and I've been in service, serving this country for over 2 decades. The words hung in the air, each one heavier than the last, and for a brief moment, the room fell into complete silence again. The kind of silence that made every breath feel like a declaration. I took a step forward, feeling their eyes on me, but this time I wasn't shrinking. This time I was standing. I didn't choose the life I have for fame. I didn't choose it for medals or applause. I chose it because it was my duty, I continued. I chose it because I wanted to make a difference, not for you to pat me on the back, but because people who need help don't care if you wear a uniform or not. They need someone who shows up. The realization hit them hard. My classmates, those who had once assumed I was a failure, a nobody, now had to reconcile the image they had created of me with the reality standing before them, and for the first time, they saw me. Flashbacks to the years I spent in service flooded my mind. I was no longer just the girl who had been dismissed by Jason's smug remarks or Chloe's superior smile. I was the woman who had sat in war rooms, making decisions that affected lives across continents. I had been the one to brief NATO on military strategy, the one they called when things were about to go sideways. I thought about the long nights, the times I had laid awake with the weight of decisions on my shoulders, wondering if the lives I had put on the line would be worth the cost. And every time, I chose the mission. I chose the people. I chose my country. As I stood there, the words I had held back for so long finally came rushing out. My military service wasn't a shadow anymore. It was a legacy, one that could no longer be ignored. I've led covert operations that kept this country safe from threats you'll never know existed, I said, my voice calm but firm. I was there during some of the darkest hours, making decisions you'll never be privy to. But I did it because I knew it was what needed to be done. Chloe's lips pressed into a tight line as she stepped forward, her face flushed. "Becca, she began, her voice tinged with something unrecognizable, but I didn't let her finish. "This wasn't about you, Chloe," I cut in, my tone sharp but controlled. "It was never about us. It was about doing what needed to be done when no one else could. And for that, I don't need your approval. I don't need anyone's approval." The crowd had gone completely still, every eye on me now, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the power in my words. They were finally listening. I allowed the silence to hang in the air for a moment longer, giving them time to absorb what I had just said. The transformation was already underway. The woman they had once mocked, the one they had forgotten, was standing before them now as someone to be reckoned with. I could feel the shift in the room, the way the air seemed to settle into something more serious, more respectful. They were beginning to understand, and that understanding was slowly transforming the way they saw me. The forgotten one had now become a figure of strength, a figure of resilience. I didn't wear my uniform. For applause, I said, softer now. I wore it because some of us protect in silence. We serve when no one is looking, and I don't regret a moment of it. Jason was the first to speak, his voice quieter now, almost apologetic. I didn't know. Becca, I had no idea. I nodded, acknowledging his words but not needing his apology. It wasn't for you to know, I replied, my voice firm but calm. It wasn't about what you thought. It was about what I knew I had to do. The weight of my words hung heavy in the room, but this time, it wasn't a weight of judgment. It was a weight of respect. Chloe's eyes flicked between Jason and me, and for a moment I thought I saw something soften in her gaze, a crack in the carefully constructed image she had built for herself. But just as quickly she pushed it aside, her mask sliding back into place. You were always so mysterious, Becca, Chloe said, her voice no longer mocking, but almost wistful. I didn't understand you. I smiled, but there was no humor in it. That's because you never tried to. The truth of my service, the years I had spent working in the shadows, was out in the open now. They had no choice but to see it, to recognize me for who I truly was. The room began to shift, slowly but surely. Whispers started to ripple through the crowd, voices soft with awe, with recognition. They hadn't known. They hadn't understood. But now, they did. I wasn't the girl who had dropped out of law school. I wasn't the woman who had faded into obscurity. I was the one who had fought, who had sacrificed, and who had served. The applause began quietly, hesitant at first, and then, as the truth of my life began to sink in, it grew louder. The respect they had once withheld was now being given freely, earned through the weight of my actions and the years of silence that had preceded this moment. As I stood there, receiving the respect I had long been denied, I realized that I had reclaimed my legacy. This wasn't about being seen by them, it was about seeing myself, and now for the first time I could finally say, I was enough. The applause gradually died down, but it wasn't loud or enthusiastic. It wasn't the kind of applause that erupts when someone performs a feat for all to see. No, this was quieter, more reverent. A slow recognition of something deeper, something earned not through spectacle, but through quiet sacrifice. As I stood at the center of the room, their eyes upon me, I felt the weight of the years I had spent fighting in silence, the weight of all the times I had felt unseen, unheard, like a ghost walking through the motions of life. But tonight, that weight had shifted. It no longer bore down on me like a burden. It had become my strength. Chloe, standing off to the side with her polished smile, had fallen silent. For once, there was no calculated performance in her demeanor. There was no need for her to be the center of attention. It was clear that the room now knew who I was, and there was nothing she could do to change that. Jason, too, had stopped speaking. His earlier mockery was gone, replaced by an expression of something like respect. The kind of respect that only comes when you truly understand the value of someone else's journey. But it was too late for any of them to catch up. They would never fully understand. I turned away from the crowd, walking toward the door with no need to look back. The evening had run its course, and I had said all I needed to say. No more explanations, no more proving myself. The night had already begun to cool, and I could feel the chill of the evening settling over me as I stepped outside. The air was different now, more peaceful, as if the world was taking a collective breath after the tension had been broken. I made my way toward the edge of the resort's grounds, the distant sounds of the party fading behind me. The strings of fairy lights still flickered across the lawn, casting their warm glow on the grass. But the light didn't feel like an invitation anymore. It felt like a memory, one I was walking away from. With each step, the space between me and the crowd grew. The quiet of the night surrounded me, pulling me in like a familiar embrace. I was no longer tethered to the false expectations they had placed on me. No longer weighed down by their assumptions of who I should be. I paused at the edge of the lawn, looking up at the vast sky above. The stars were scattered like diamonds against the dark velvet of the night, distant and endless. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, crisp air, letting the quiet seep into me. There was no loud fanfare, no standing ovation, just silence. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of a car engine, the soft rustle of the leaves in the trees. But it was the kind of silence I had learned to embrace. The silence that comes after a storm has passed. The silence that tells you that you've done all you can. And now, you simply need to be still. The reunion would continue without me. The guests would return to their lives, their conversations about success and status, their curated versions of who they thought they were. But I wouldn't be a part of it anymore. I had already stepped into my own truth, and nothing they said could change that. I turned, walking away from the lights and the noise, my heels silent against the grass. I didn't need their applause, didn't need their validation. I had already found the respect I had been searching for, not in their eyes, but in my own reflection. As I walked down the dark path leading away from the resort, I felt a sense of satisfaction settle over me. Not the fleeting satisfaction of applause, but the deep, unwavering kind that comes from knowing that I had lived my truth. I had carried my burdens without complaint, protected those who needed it, and faced the darkness without asking for light. And in that moment I realized something I hadn't truly understood before. I was never invisible. I had simply chosen to move through the world quietly, silently doing the work that needed to be done without seeking anything in return. The truth wasn't loud, it wasn't glamorous, but it was there, just beneath the surface, quietly shaping my legacy. I reached the edge of the path and paused, looking back one last time at the glowing lights of the resort. A soft breeze stirred the trees, their leaves whispering as they swayed in the night. In the distance, I could hear the faint clinking of glasses, the final notes of the orchestra playing in the ballroom. But it didn't reach me here. As I walked further into the quiet night, my mind turned to the few who would understand, the ones who served in silence, who didn't need to be seen to know their purpose, the ones who carried their burdens without ever asking for recognition. The true warriors. In the distance, I saw my car approaching, the headlights piercing through the night. It was time to leave the past behind, to continue on the path I had always been meant to walk. No more reunions, no more pretending, just the next chapter. I reached my car and paused, standing for a moment before opening the door. I let my fingers linger on the handle. There was a quiet sense of pride inside me. Pride that had never been about medals or public recognition. Pride that came from the silent work, the untold sacrifices. I slid into the seat and closed the door, behind me. The car's engine started, and the world outside shifted once more, but this time it didn't matter. I wasn't leaving behind the applause or the recognition. I was leaving behind the need for any of it. As the car pulled away, I glanced out the window. The lights of the resort blurred in the distance, and with it, the crowd that had once defined me. But I wasn't defined by them anymore. I was defined by my actions, by my silence, by my strength. And that was enough.